Imagine being dropped into enemy territory with nothing but what you can carry. No supply lines, no backup, no way home. For thousands of Allied soldiers in World War II, this wasn't imagination. It was survival. The numbers tell the story. During Operation Market Garden in 1944, over 2,000 British paratroopers found themselves trapped behind German lines for 9 days with dwindling supplies. In Burma, Ord Wingate's Chindits operated 200 miles behind Japanese lines for up to 4 months at a time. The Office of Strategic Services dropped hundreds of operatives into occupied Europe, many of whom survived for months without any contact with Allied forces. These weren't elite special forces trained for years in survival techniques. Most were ordinary infantry soldiers, radio operators, and medics who suddenly found themselves in the most hostile environment imaginable. They had to transform from conventional fighters into ghosts, living off the land while evading capture by forces that controlled every road, every village, and every potential hiding spot. The challenges went far beyond what any survival manual could prepare them for. This wasn't camping in friendly wilderness. Every smoke column from a cooking fire could bring enemy patrols. Every footprint left in soft ground might lead to their capture. Every local civilian they encountered could be a resistance fighter offering help or a collaborator ready to turn them in for a bounty. Weather became both friend and enemy. Rain washed away tracks, but made movement treacherous and hypothermia a constant threat. Snow provided camouflage, but left clear trails for tracking dogs. Summer heat in places like North Africa and the Pacific created water crises that could kill faster than enemy bullets. The psychological pressure was unlike anything these soldiers had experienced. In normal combat, you could see your enemy and fight back. Behind enemy lines, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Every sound at night could be a patrol. Every stranger on a forest path might be your last encounter. The stress of constant vigilance, combined with hunger, thirst, and exhaustion, broke many men before the enemy ever found them. Medical care meant self-treatment or death. A broken bone that would be a minor inconvenience in friendly territory became a potential death sentence. Infections from small cuts could turn fatal without proper antiseptics. Soldiers had to become their own doctors, using whatever they could find or carry to treat everything from bullet wounds to dysentery. Communication with friendly forces was nearly impossible and incredibly dangerous. Radio transmissions could be intercepted and used to triangulate positions. Coded messages left at dead drops might never be found. Some soldiers went weeks without any confirmation that the war was even still being fought, relying only on distant artillery sounds or aircraft overhead to guess at the broader situation. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest challenge. Soldiers used to the camaraderie and support of their units suddenly found themselves in groups of 3 or 4, sometimes completely alone. They had to maintain morale and sanity while dealing with the constant possibility that they might never see home again. Many kept detailed diaries, not just to record intelligence, but to maintain some connection to their former lives and identities. Supply drops, when they came at all, were hit or miss affairs. Packages dropped by parachute could land anywhere within a several-mile radius. They might fall directly into enemy hands, land in inaccessible terrain, or be scattered by wind across an area too large to search safely. More often than not, soldiers had to assume no help was coming and plan accordingly. The enemy wasn't just trying to capture them. In many theaters, standing orders called for the execution of soldiers caught operating behind lines. The Geneva Convention offered little protection to men found in civilian clothes or conducting sabotage operations. Capture meant interrogation, torture, and almost certain death. This knowledge added another layer of stress to every decision about whether to trust a local guide, whether to risk a supply raid, or whether to keep moving despite exhaustion. Different theaters presented unique challenges that required constantly adapting survival strategies. In the dense jungles of Burma, visibility was measured in yards, but the sound of movement carried for miles. Japanese patrols knew every trail, but the jungle provided endless hiding spots for those who learned to move silently. In the North African desert, visibility extended for miles in every direction, making concealment nearly impossible during daylight hours. Water was scarce, but the empty landscape meant that supply dumps and patrol routes were predictable and could be avoided with careful planning. European operations presented their own complications. The countryside was densely populated, meaning that avoiding contact with civilians was nearly impossible. Every village had German garrison troops or local collaborators who knew their neighbors and would notice strangers immediately. But the same populated landscape provided opportunities for those who could successfully connect with resistance networks that had been operating underground for years. These soldiers had to learn skills that weren't taught in basic training. They became experts in reading terrain for defensive positions and escape routes. They learned to identify edible plants and clean water sources by observing what local wildlife consumed. They developed an almost supernatural awareness of human activity, able to detect the presence of enemy patrols from subtle changes in bird behavior or the way smoke rose from distant villages. The men who survived these ordeals came back changed. They had discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed and had lived through experiences that few humans ever face. Their stories weren't just tales of individual heroism, but lessons in human adaptability and the will to survive against impossible odds. They proved that ordinary people could endure extraordinary circumstances when failure meant not just personal death, but the potential failure of missions that could affect the outcome of the entire war. When your supply drop doesn't come and enemy patrols control every road, hunger becomes your first enemy. Cut-off soldiers couldn't just forage like camping enthusiasts. They had to eat without revealing their position, without getting sick, and without alerting the local population who might be watching for exactly this kind of activity. The first rule was absolute: never hunt with weapons. Gunshots traveled for miles in quiet countryside and brought immediate investigation from enemy forces. Even small game traps were dangerous because they required soldiers to return to specific locations repeatedly, creating patterns that could be detected and ambushed. Instead, survival meant mastering the art of silent procurement and invisible foraging. Raiding enemy supply points became a calculated science. Soldiers learned to observe German or Japanese supply routines for days before making any move. They noted which guards were lazy, which times of day saw less activity, and which supply dumps were checked less frequently. The key was taking only what wouldn't be immediately missed. A few rations from a large stockpile, some canned goods from the back of a supply truck, medical supplies that could be attributed to normal usage. Too much missing at once would trigger security sweeps that could compromise the entire area. Field kitchens provided opportunities, but required perfect timing. German field units often prepared more food than they consumed, and the leftover portions were typically discarded or left unguarded while troops moved to new positions. Soldiers learned to time these scavenging missions for the narrow window after enemy forces departed, but before new units arrived to occupy the same area. The abandoned food had to be consumed immediately since carrying it posed too great a risk of discovery. Foraging required becoming an instant expert in local botany. Soldiers carried small identification guides when possible, but more often had to rely on observation and local knowledge. In Burma, Chindit forces learned to identify dozens of edible plants from their Burmese guides. Bamboo shoots could be eaten raw or cooked and provided both nutrition and water. Wild berries were abundant in certain seasons, but required careful identification since poisonous varieties often grew alongside edible ones. European operations offered different opportunities. Dandelion greens were available almost year-round and could be eaten raw or cooked. Wild onions grew in most climates and added both flavor and nutrition to otherwise bland meals. Rose hips contained vitamin C and could prevent scurvy during extended periods without fresh food. Soldiers learned to recognize these plants in all seasons and conditions, since the same species might look completely different in spring versus autumn. Water presented even more complex challenges than food. Soldiers carried water purification tablets when available, but these supplies were limited and had to be conserved for emergencies. Boiling water was the most reliable purification method, but required fires that produced smoke and light. Soldiers learned to build tiny fires using dry wood that burned with minimal smoke, often during rainy periods when the moisture in the air would disperse smoke quickly. Natural water sources had to be evaluated constantly. Fast-moving streams were generally safer than stagnant ponds, but even clean-looking water could carry diseases that would incapacitate a soldier within days. Soldiers learned to look for animal tracks around water sources, reasoning that if local wildlife used the water regularly without apparent ill effects, it was probably safe for human consumption. Rainwater collection became an essential skill. Soldiers used ponchos, helmets, and any available containers to catch precipitation. They learned to set up collection systems that funneled water from large surface areas into small containers, maximizing the amount collected during brief showers. The first few minutes of rainfall were often contaminated by whatever had been sitting on collection surfaces, so experienced soldiers learned to let the initial flow wash their equipment clean before beginning to collect drinking water. Trading with local populations was the most dangerous but sometimes most rewarding source of supplies. In occupied territories, civilians who helped Allied soldiers faced torture and execution if discovered. Despite these risks, many chose to help anyway, often motivated by their own resistance to occupation forces. These transactions required elaborate security measures to protect both soldiers and civilians. Dead drops became the preferred method for civilian assistance. Local resistance members would leave supplies at predetermined locations, often hidden in hollow trees, abandoned buildings, or buried in specific spots marked by subtle signs that would be invisible to casual observers but clear to those who knew what to look for. Soldiers would retrieve these supplies hours or days later, long after the civilians had left the area. Payment for civilian assistance usually came in the form of military equipment that could be useful to resistance operations. Weapons, ammunition, and explosives were valuable to guerrilla fighters and could be traded for food and information. Soldiers learned to evaluate which pieces of their equipment were most valuable for trade while keeping enough firepower for their own protection. Enemy ration procurement required understanding different military food systems. German forces used distinctive packaging and portion sizes that soldiers learned to recognize from a distance. Japanese rations often included rice-based items that provided substantial nutrition but required cooking, which posed additional security challenges. American soldiers operating behind Axis lines learned to identify and safely consume enemy field rations while understanding which items might be spoiled or deliberately contaminated. Seasonal availability affected all food procurement strategies. Spring brought new plant growth, but also increased enemy patrol activity as better weather allowed for more extensive search operations. Summer provided the greatest variety of wild food, but also the highest risk of dehydration and heat-related medical problems. Autumn offered nuts, late berries, and other high-nutrition wild foods, but also meant shorter days and less time for safe movement. Winter severely limited foraging options, but provided opportunities to preserve food through natural freezing. Storage and preservation of acquired food required constant vigilance. Any food that spoiled could cause illness that would compromise the entire group. Soldiers learned to consume perishable items immediately while saving non-perishable supplies for emergencies. They developed techniques for smoking meat over small fires, drying fruits and vegetables, and storing food in ways that protected it from moisture and pests, while keeping it accessible for quick retrieval and consumption. Survival behind enemy lines wasn't just about calories and water. It was about becoming invisible while staying combat-ready for weeks at a time. Every aspect of daily life had to be reimagined for an environment where the smallest mistake could mean capture, torture, and execution. Movement became a precise art form practiced only under cover of darkness. Soldiers learned to navigate using star patterns that most had only heard about in training. The North Star provided consistent direction in European and North African theaters, while different constellations guided movement in Pacific regions. Cloud cover that blocked celestial navigation required backup techniques using wind direction, terrain features, and even the way moss grew on tree trunks in different climates. The mechanics of silent movement required relearning how to walk. Soldiers practiced placing their feet heel-to-toe to reduce noise and improve balance on uneven terrain. They learned to test each step before committing their full weight, feeling for loose rocks, dry branches, or soft ground that might create noise or visible tracks. Single-file movement with each person stepping exactly in the footprints of the person ahead became standard procedure, minimizing the visible evidence of group passage. Rest periods were carefully orchestrated security operations rather than simple breaks from activity. Soldiers established watch rotations that ensured constant observation of approaches to their position while allowing others to sleep. These rotations accounted for individual circadian rhythms, since some soldiers remained more alert during certain hours than others. The most reliable sentries took the critical pre-dawn hours when human alertness naturally reached its lowest point. Sleeping positions were chosen for concealment and rapid escape rather than comfort. Soldiers learned to sleep in their equipment, ready to move instantly if discovery seemed imminent. They developed techniques for resting while maintaining awareness of their surroundings, training themselves to wake immediately at the first sign of unusual sounds or activity. Deep sleep was a luxury that few could afford for more than brief periods. Medical care meant accepting that serious injuries would likely be fatal without immediate evacuation to friendly territory. Soldiers carried basic first aid supplies, but had to stretch these resources over weeks or months of operations. They learned to prioritize treatment based on what would keep them mobile and combat effective rather than what would provide the most complete healing. Wound cleaning became critical in environments where infection could develop rapidly. Soldiers learned to identify plants with antiseptic properties that could substitute for medical supplies when necessary. Tree bark could be fashioned into splints for broken bones. Clothing was repurposed into bandages and tourniquets. Pain management often relied on mental techniques rather than medications, since painkillers that might impair judgment or reaction time were too dangerous to use except in the most extreme circumstances. Infection prevention required constant attention to hygiene despite limited resources for cleanliness. Soldiers learned to clean wounds with whatever clean water was available, often using precious drinking water for medical purposes when no other source existed. They developed techniques for keeping wounds dry and covered using materials salvaged from their environment. Small injuries that would be insignificant in normal circumstances required careful monitoring since any infection could quickly become life-threatening. Communication with friendly forces involved elaborate security measures to prevent enemy interception and direction finding. Radio transmissions had to be brief, coded, and transmitted from locations that could be abandoned immediately after use. Soldiers learned to identify terrain features that would block or redirect radio signals, helping to mask their true transmission locations from enemy monitoring stations. Dead drops for intelligence sharing required the same security measures as civilian supply contacts. Information about enemy troop movements, supply routes, and defensive positions had to be recorded in ways that would be meaningful to Allied forces, but incomprehensible to enemy investigators if discovered. Soldiers developed personal coding systems that could convey essential intelligence in messages that appeared to be innocent personal correspondence or commercial documents. The psychological pressure of extended isolation required active mental health maintenance techniques. Soldiers learned to recognize the early signs of combat stress and depression in themselves and their companions. They developed routines for maintaining morale that didn't compromise operational security. Sharing memories of home, discussing post-war plans, and maintaining personal grooming standards helped preserve individual identity and group cohesion during the darkest periods. Sleep deprivation management became essential for maintaining combat effectiveness over extended periods. Soldiers learned to recognize the symptoms of severe exhaustion that could lead to fatal mistakes in judgment. They developed techniques for taking advantage of brief rest opportunities, training themselves to fall asleep quickly in uncomfortable conditions and wake refreshed after short periods of rest. Weather presented constant challenges that required adaptive strategies for each season and climate. Rain provided drinking water and covered movement sounds, but also brought hypothermia risks and made travel treacherous on muddy or slippery terrain. Soldiers learned to use rain as cover for particularly risky movements while taking precautions against exposure injuries that could disable them for days. Snow offered concealment opportunities but created tracking problems that required careful route planning. Soldiers learned to move during snowfall when their tracks would be quickly covered, and to avoid areas where their passage would create obvious disturbances in snow cover. They developed techniques for staying warm without fires and for preventing frostbite during extended periods of cold weather exposure. Heat management in desert or tropical environments required completely different survival strategies. Soldiers learned to recognize the early signs of heat exhaustion and heat stroke, conditions that could incapacitate them quickly in extreme temperatures. They developed techniques for cooling their bodies using limited water supplies and for finding or creating shade during the hottest parts of the day when movement was impossible. Camouflage became a total lifestyle rather than just a clothing choice. Soldiers learned to modify their appearance to blend with local populations when possible, growing or removing facial hair, adjusting posture and movement patterns, and acquiring civilian clothing that wouldn't immediately identify them as military personnel. They practiced moving and behaving in ways that would attract minimal attention from casual observers while remaining ready for instant combat if discovery became inevitable. Extended survival behind enemy lines required thinking beyond the next meal or the next hiding spot. Successful soldiers developed comprehensive systems that could sustain them for months while maintaining their combat effectiveness and intelligence-gathering capabilities. Supply cache management became a cornerstone of long-term survival strategy. Soldiers learned to establish networks of hidden stockpiles that could support them across large geographic areas. These caches were positioned along likely movement routes, but far enough apart that the discovery of one wouldn't compromise the others. Each cache contained a calculated mix of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and emergency equipment that could sustain a small group for several days. Cache construction required understanding local environmental conditions that would affect stored supplies over extended periods. In tropical climates, waterproofing was essential to prevent mold and rot from destroying food and equipment. Desert environments required protection from extreme temperature fluctuations that could damage sensitive items like medications and radio equipment. European caches had to account for seasonal changes that could make buried supplies inaccessible during winter months. Location selection for caches involved balancing accessibility with security. Sites needed to be memorable enough for soldiers to find again after weeks or months away, but not so obvious that enemy forces or local civilians would discover them accidentally. Soldiers learned to use natural landmarks that wouldn't change over time, like distinctive rock formations, unique tree arrangements, or permanent geographic features that would remain recognizable regardless of seasonal changes. Intelligence gathering evolved from a secondary mission into a primary survival tool. The longer soldiers remained in enemy territory, the more valuable their observations became to Allied military planning. They learned to recognize and document enemy unit insignia, equipment types, and operational patterns that could provide crucial intelligence about enemy strength and intentions. Troop movement documentation required developing systems for recording detailed information without creating documents that would compromise their mission if captured. Soldiers learned to memorize complex details about enemy formations, using mental techniques that allowed them to retain accurate information for weeks before having the opportunity to pass it along to friendly forces. They developed personal shorthand systems for recording observations that would be meaningless to enemy investigators but could be expanded into detailed intelligence reports. Supply route analysis became increasingly sophisticated as soldiers learned to recognize the logistical patterns that sustained enemy operations. They identified which roads were used for different types of supplies, which times of day saw the heaviest traffic, and which routes were most vulnerable to interdiction. This intelligence was valuable not only for Allied planning, but also for the soldiers' own survival, since understanding enemy logistics helped them predict patrol patterns and identify opportunities for supply procurement. Local network development was perhaps the most dangerous but most rewarding aspect of extended operations. Building relationships with resistance fighters and sympathetic civilians required months of careful evaluation and trust building. Soldiers learned to distinguish between genuine resistance members and potential collaborators through subtle tests and observations that revealed true loyalties without exposing their own identities. Trust verification involved elaborate security protocols that protected both soldiers and civilians. Initial contacts often involved no direct communication, with each side demonstrating their reliability through actions rather than words. Resistance members might provide small services like leaving food or warning of patrol activity, while soldiers proved their identity and mission through knowledge that only genuine Allied personnel would possess. Communication networks developed slowly and required multiple layers of security to prevent enemy penetration. Messages passed through several intermediaries before reaching their intended recipients, with each link in the chain knowing only enough to pass information along without compromising the entire network. Soldiers learned to compartmentalize their knowledge so that even if captured and interrogated, they couldn't reveal information that would endanger their contacts. Long-term medical care required developing expertise in treating chronic conditions with limited resources. Soldiers learned to manage ongoing health problems like malnutrition, parasitic infections, and untreated injuries that would affect their performance over months of operations. They became experts in preventive medicine, understanding that maintaining health was much easier than treating serious illness in their circumstances. Psychological resilience became increasingly important as missions extended beyond their originally planned duration. Soldiers developed mental techniques for maintaining hope and motivation when prospects for extraction or return to friendly lines seemed increasingly remote. They learned to set short-term goals that provided a sense of progress and achievement even when their overall situation remained unchanged for weeks at a time. Some soldiers never made it back to friendly lines, but continued fighting as guerrilla leaders for months or even years after their original units had been declared missing. These men learned local languages, adopted local customs, and became integral parts of resistance movements that continued operations long after conventional military forces had moved to other theaters. Guerrilla leadership required completely different skills from conventional military command. Soldiers learned to work with civilian fighters who had different motivations, training levels, and operational capabilities than regular military personnel. They developed techniques for planning and executing operations that maximized impact while minimizing risk to civilian populations who couldn't be evacuated or protected like military personnel. Adaptation to local conditions became total immersion in the culture and environment where they operated. Soldiers learned to think like locals, understanding not just the language and customs, but the underlying social dynamics that determined who could be trusted and who posed threats. They developed instincts about local politics, economic conditions, and social relationships that helped them navigate complex situations involving multiple competing interests. The soldiers who survived extended periods behind enemy lines returned with capabilities that served them throughout their lives. They had learned to make critical decisions with limited information, to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, and to maintain focus and determination even when facing seemingly impossible odds. Their experiences provided lessons in human resilience and adaptability that went far beyond military applications, demonstrating that ordinary people could develop extraordinary capabilities when survival depended on constant learning and adaptation. Their stories remind us that survival isn't about having perfect equipment or following predetermined plans. It's about developing the mental flexibility to constantly reassess situations, the physical resilience to endure extended hardship, and the emotional strength to maintain hope and purpose even when completely cut off from the normal sources of support and guidance that most people depend on for their daily functioning.